the Drive Nation podcast with Dan Prosser and Andrew Frankel.
Before we get stuck into a handful of recent DN posts, Andrew, I just wanted to tell our wonderful podcast audience that DN is now on Patreon.
Woo!
Yeah, it took us 2 years to get up on there, but we've finally done it. For people that don't know, Patreon is a platform that allows, and it's a horrible term, but it does apply, content creators like us to invite their audiences to contribute a small amount of money each month just to help make whatever it is that content creator does more sustainable, short term and long term. And that's how it applies to us, really. We're inviting anyone who wants to contribute to DN, to making it more sustainable now and to allow Andrew and I to make it bigger and better in the future, to do so. People can choose how much or how little they want to contribute, and in return, all our patrons are going to get weekly articles from Andrew and I, exclusively. There'll be weekly articles that we'll do reviews, we'll do opinion pieces, we'll do features similar to the stuff that we do on Instagram, but these will be a bit longer and a bit more in-depth and for patrons only. So if anyone does want to contribute, go along to patreon.com/Drive Nation, and you'll find us there. If you're minded to, if you can afford to, we'd be so grateful for any support that you can give. Anything to add, Andrew?
Well, only that, just so people understand where we are. If you follow us on Instagram, you will have seen a few sponsored posts and that sort of thing. So you will be aware that DN is earning a little bit of money, but it's not a free thing for us to do. We have to promote stuff, we have to buy in stuff, and just so you know that to date, although we're nearly 2 years in, Dan and I have yet to see a single penny out of the business. So we're not paying ourselves. We are still doing this absolutely free, gratis, and for nothing, and because we love it. So you're not really. What we're asking is really for an investment in DN. It's not investment in Dan and me. It's so that this thing, which I think we certainly love, and there are certainly tens of thousands of other people out there who seem to appreciate it. It's just so that we can keep on doing it, and it's as simple as that. So if you can support us on Patreon, Dan and I would be absolutely chuffed to bits.
Yeah. It's patreon.com/Drive Nation. You'll also find a link directly there in our bio on our Instagram page @DriveNation_. And yeah, to everybody who has pledged so far, thank you so much. It's enormously humbling. Fine, well, that's that done. Shall we
promo over?
On? Exactly. Let's crack on and let's talk about the biggest story, the biggest post on DN in the past week or so, and very sadly, Andrew, it's the passing of Hans Mezger, the revered Porsche engineer. Yeah,
you see, I just wonder whether outside the world of die-hard car enthusiasts, DNers and everything else, just how revered he is. I mean, I think there are lots of people out there who've probably heard of, the Colombo engines in Ferraris and Lampredi engines and that sort of thing. But I just wonder whether Metzger ever got the worldwide recognition as one of the absolute all-time great engineers of this business that his achievements deserve. And it's very interesting that I just posted a little piece on DN when we heard that he'd sadly passed away at the age of 90. The response has just been amazing, and I think among those who know, the greatest engineer of our era. You could say Ferdinand Piëch, because Metzger and him worked hand in hand, side by side for many, many years, and it's quite hard to divorce the work of one from the other. But he's right up there, isn't he?
Yeah, there's no question about it. He was also part of that cabal of engineers and Porsche folk who started at the company in the very, very early days in the 50s. And then just didn't go anywhere. They stuck around, and it must have been an extraordinary thing to witness firsthand. This company going from, a small sports car maker building 356s, progressing through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on, watching it win Le Mans countless times, watching it really take over the sports car world.
Absolutely.
Particularly with the 911. What a thing to have observed firsthand.
Yeah, I mean, and also, for him, for given his involvement in the 911, to see that, that little overhead cam 2-litre flat six that he was so involved with. And again, I don't think many people realise Metzger was absolutely integral to the. Everybody thinks about the Metzger engine, which I'm sure we'll come to later on in the podcast. But he was there. He was there at the get-go, and this little engine that he, as I say, he was. Whose design he was integral to, and just to see, up until his death, whatever it was, 57 years later, a flat six engine still being in the back of a 911. He must have been chuffed by that every time he saw one growl past in the street. And then, the stuff that he did between those poles, and as you say, coming to Porsche as a man in his, well, he was actually in his late 20s, wasn't he, in the late 1950s, and here was this still very little company making 356s and sort of 550 Spider race cars, and then within a decade you got a 917. I mean, it is pretty extraordinary, and I think you could absolutely. For instance. One of the things that he was very involved with, again, this isn't very well known, the engine that went into the 911 wasn't the one that was originally designed for it. In the 1950s, as they were working on this car, they designed it was an air-cooled flat six, but it had push rods. It had very long push rods, and if that engine had made it into production, the engine would never have revved, you could never have tuned it, you certainly couldn't have raced it, and the entire history of Porsche might have been, rather different. And Metzger was one of the guys who took a look at this engine when he turned down and just went, hang on, if it has to have two camshafts, why not just put them where they're meant to be, and stick them in the cylinder heads? And they did, and that engine was born, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Oh, a hell of a legacy that he had, wasn't it? So, after, can you remember off the top of your head, Andrew, how soon after joining Porsche was he put in charge of the racing division?
I don't know. Oh, well, I don't know, I'm afraid, off the top of my head, the exact date that he turned up, but I think it was very late in the 1950s, maybe 59, something like that. And we know that the first thing that he became known for, even before the 911 engine, was working on the air-cooled flat 8 engine that was used in the 804 Grand Prix car, the car that won the 1962 French Grand Prix, with Dan Gurney driving it, then and now the one and only World Championship Grand Prix that a Porsche has ever won. So he did that. He then went and worked on the 911 engine, and then in 1965, the sort of proper racing department that we know of, which built all those crazy space frame cars from then on. So like after the 904, but from the 906 onwards, he and Piek went and headed up that department, and from there on in, right up until his retirement in the early 1990s, he was the man. He wasn't the only man, but if there was one man who could call himself the man, I guess it was Metzger.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's his overarching achievement, though? I mean, is it the TAG Formula One engine that won so many races with McLaren? Is it that 901 engine that ultimately became the 911 engine? Or is it the 917 and Porsche's first 2 outright victories at Le Mans?
Well, I mean, overarching achievement. I think his achievement is, so this is an ultimate cop-out answer to your question. Is the excellence that he applied to absolutely everything that he did. If you look at, just take. I just want to think of an example. You take the first 917 engine. Okay, it came out in 1969, 4.5 litres. It had 580 horsepower. And as long as you didn't over rev it, it was pretty much bomb proof. Okay, now that was a 4.5 litre engine with 2 valves per cylinder because it was air cooled. There wasn't enough space to cool the heads with 4 valves per cylinder, so they were very restricted on the cylinder head design. And you look at the Ferrari engine that Maranello created to rival it, the 5 litre, so a bigger engine, V12 with 4 valve heads that went into the 512S. That had about 540, 550 horsepower. So a bigger engine with 4 valve cylinder heads and a Ferrari engine, and it never got near what Metzger managed to achieve with air cooling, 2 valves per cylinder and a smaller engine. So and they were just so reliable. The 917-30 engine, the 1100 horsepower monster that totally and utterly dominated Can-Am in 72 and 73. I mean, they just never went wrong. And you look at the domination of the 956s and the 962s in Group C in the 1980s. You know, what is the outstanding characteristic? I mean, they didn't never go wrong, but they were so reliable. They were just better than everything else. They were faster. They were more reliable. They even worked out how to make them use less fuel because, you know, Group C was very much a fuel efficiency formula. And so, just in all, the answer to your question is what was his contribution? It was just excellence in everything he did, from a little 2-litre flat six in 1963 to, you know, the Metzger engine that went out of production with a 4-litre 997 GT3 RS in whenever it was, 2011, I think. I mean, what a legacy! Extraordinary.
Unbelievable, isn't it? Okay, well, it's also true though that he had responsibility not just for the 917's engine, but for the project overall.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all those cars. You know, when he went to the racing department in '65, he didn't go there just to make engines. You know, all those amazing cars. You know, the 906, the 907, the 908, the insane 909 Berg Spider, the 910. Obviously the 917. I mean, they were, again, you can't say that they were all his work, but you know, they were all done on his watch, and in their way. I mean, they took Porsche from being a sort of bit player competing for, you know, class honours, to the most revered, successful manufacturer of sports racing cars in the world. And you know, and as I said earlier, it's, you know, it's not fair to say it was all Metzger, but it's certainly also not fair to say it was all Piech. You know, between them and with everybody else, they made history. They absolutely made history, and they put Porsche's name on a map in a way that I'm sure, you know, back at the start of that decade, you know, Ferry Porsche couldn't have imagined.
So what we now need to address, Andrew, is the fact that you, being perhaps the most fortunate person I know, you've driven 917s more than once.
Yeah.
So you're going to have to give us a couple of minutes now on what that experience is like, because having not done so myself, wow, I just can't imagine.
Okay. So these things, they all depend on the environment, and there have been other racing cars I've driven where, you know, you've had a very understandably nervous owner who says, oh, no more than this number of revs, no more than that number of laps, you've got to keep off the curbs, you can't, you know, push hard or anything. And where I feel as lucky to have been allowed to drive both 917s as hard as I liked, as I feel lucky to have driven a 917, because to have gotten into a 917 and not being able to drive it properly, I always sort of make the analogy of taking the cork out of a bottle of, you know, Chateau Lafite and only being allowed to sniff the contents. It's so the first one was Richard Atwood's car. It was a long time ago at Silverstone. This it looked like the car in which he won Le Mans in 1970. It was to exactly that specification, but it was actually its sister car. So this was chassis 22, and I think 23 won the race. But it was one of the cars that was in the Le Mans Steve McQueen movie, and then got sold to Reinhold Jost, who raced it a bit. And I can just remember getting in that. And this was as cooking a 917 as you could get. 4.5 litre car, 4-speed gearbox, short tail. You know, the most boring 911.
This was the LX version, was it?
Absolutely. And it just totally and utterly blew my mind. You know, I was at Silverstone. I had the circuit to myself. The weather was lovely. It was quite cold, but we actually ran it on wets, and so you could get some heat into the tyres. And the amazing thing was, it didn't scare me. It just didn't scare me, because, you know, they'd sorted out the aero by then. I think the chassis was a bit stiffer too, and it was just the most, you know, because you know what that noise is like, because you've heard the McQueen movie, you know, you watched the McQueen movie and you've heard the sound, and to be in it, and it's just this sense of privilege. You can barely believe it. It's such a tiny little thing as well. They had to take the seat out for me to drive it, but that was okay. And yeah.
So what do you sat? Are you just sat on some tubes or something?
Yeah, well, I think no, they put some foam in, so I was reasonably well located. But I can remember we were only using the national circuit, which was, so you got the old pit straight and Copse, and then, but I can remember it still did over 170 miles an hour 3 times a lap, ran a really short lap. And this was, you know, this was a car that was, you know, built in 1969. So yeah, I mean, the sense of occasion. And Richard Atwood, that was the other thing. Atwood was there. And his literally the only thing he was bothered about was whether I felt I'd had a proper go. And he kept on saying, yes, but have you had a proper go? And I was going, well, I think so, Richard. No, well, get out there and try harder. He was incredible.
He's one of those former racing drivers who really gets how much people like you and I just sort of idolise that era of racing, and the guys like him who race those cars in period. He just understands it, doesn't he?
Yeah, and of course you could never have the experience, because let's not forget when he won Le Mans in 1970, there were 50, 60 other lunatics on the track. It was 24 hours. You had to race it at night. It rained most of the time. I mean, you cannot do what I did and think you have any idea at all of what he went through. But nevertheless, you've driven a 917, and Richard Atwood is there saying, get back in the car and drive it harder. And I suppose the other memory of it is just that Porsche approach, because this car is a very old car, and yet it starts with a key. No special sequence of switches and pumps to prime and widgets to do this and that and the other. You just turn it. It's like you start a 917 the same way that you start a 911 or indeed a Ford Fiesta, and synchromesh gearbox. Because Porsche understood that easily the least reliable component in any car is the one that sits behind the steering wheel and operates it. So you make life easy for him. Proper ventilation, all that sort of stuff. They just thought of that because they realised these things had to be driven by not just professional race drivers in sprint races, but gentleman drivers who may have more money than talent. Over 24 hours, and so that was that. And the other one was the 917-30 at Goodwood last year. And I don't know whether I banged on about that in a podcast yet, but that was...
I don't think you have, so let's get stuck into it. So this was the 50th anniversary celebrations.
Yeah, 50th anniversary of the 917, and actually, I mean, I'd like to say they gave me the most powerful one because they thought I was a superhero. In fact, it was an entirely practical thing, because they gave it to me because it was the only one which didn't have a roof, so I could stick out the top, and there was, I'd have some chance of being able to drive it, because if anybody doesn't know me, I'm 6'4", so these things are always a bit of a challenge, and it wouldn't start. There were 5 917s there. Dickie was in a 917-10. Harris was in. The car they call the Taxi, the Gulf 917, probably the most successful of them all, which is still owned by the factory. And it's called the Taxi because they used to go and scare the wits out of visiting executives when they used to come to Visac in the early 70s by just giving them a lift around the track in this thing. And there was, I think it was Mark Webber in the original 001 917. And they all fired up beautifully. And the 917-30, which I was to drive, which was, an absolutely reliable car at any other time, just wouldn't start. And it wouldn't start. And they just tried everything. And the other cars had gone to the assembly area, and they'd spent half a day trying to get this thing to go. And in the end, I think somebody from Goodwood just turned up with a Land Rover, an old Land Rover, and a rope. And we towed it through the paddock. People, it was health and safety, out the window, with people scattering left, right and centre. And then suddenly there was this bang, which was all the stuff they'd stuck in the engine to try to get it to start, all going igniting at the same time. And then after that, it was honestly, other than getting married and watching my children being born, it was one of the happiest moments of my life. That just hearing the sound of that 1100 horsepower, 5.4 litre, flat 12 motor, happily sort of running away to itself, just warming up, and butter wouldn't melt as if nothing. I'd almost had a heart attack waiting for that thing. Harris actually, here's the mark of a true mate. I was tearing my hair out, wandering up and down this line of all these other 917s, and knowing I wasn't going to get to drive one. And Harris flipped open the door of the Taxi and said, "What's the problem?" And I explained to him, and he just started undoing his belts and said, "Have this one." And I didn't, and I never would have done, and I couldn't have got into it. But instinctively, his reaction was just have this one, which I just thought was amazing. Anyway, so I got in this thing, and I'd spoken to a lot of people who'd driven it, and they all said one thing, and these are unlike me, proper professional racing drivers. Derek Bell, Richard Atwood, I think I spoke to Dario Marino, and they all just said, "Don't worry, it's fine." And I'm going, "Yeah, really? 1100 horsepower, a 917.
What does the car weigh?
850, I think.
Oof,
wow. Nothing. And they just said, "Don't worry, it'll be fine." And it's just one of those cars that I wasn't out the first corner before I suddenly realised it will be fine, because it just felt what it was, which was after it was in its fourth year by then. It just felt like a thoroughly developed racing car. I mean, in 1969, as I'm sure lots of people listening to this will know, the car was, tricky is putting it very, very mildly indeed. I mean, some would say it was lethal. In fact, it did kill a bloke called John Wolfe, the first ever privateer driver of a 917, did get killed in one, literally on the opening lap of Le Mans in 1969. He crashed at Whitehouse. And his co-driver, a bloke called Digby Martland, who's actually an old family friend of mine, had gone down there and he'd driven the thing in practice and spun it down the end of Mulsanne, and just mercifully didn't hit anything, got it back to the pits, got out the car and said, I'm not driving this, and if you've got any sense, neither should you. And Digby went home, and so they lent John Wolfe Herbert Linger, the test driver, and they begged Wolfe to let Linger start the race, because he'd been racing Porsches at Le Mans for donkey's years. And Wolfe said, nope, sorry, my car, my race, if it goes bang, I won't get to drive it, so I'm going to start. And tragically, his race and the rest of his life lasted less than one lap. But anyway, so I've got completely sidetracked. So the 30, yeah. Dickie and I had a bit of a problem, in fact, in that there was another bloke there in an Interserie 9710 who appeared to either be going shopping or not know his way around Goodwood. And we'd been told that if you overtook him, it was a black flag offence, and you would literally be hauled off the track if you overtook anyone. So we spent most of our time just sort of hanging back half a lap and then, giving it the beans to try and catch up with this chap. So Webber and Harris, who didn't have this problem because they'd started in front, disappeared. But I did get most of a lap driving a 91730 as hard and as fast as I was happy to drive it. And that obviously means without taking anything that I would recognise as a risk. And I can remember the single most memorable thing was coming out the chicane at the start of this lap. And, you obviously have to be very, very gentle with it. It's only got 4 gears, so in first and second. But coming out the chicane, accelerating hard through second, and then putting it into third. I'm now basically where the sort of finish line is. So I'm getting quite near the corner at the end of the straight. I'm at the top end of third. It's probably doing 120, 130 miles an hour. And I think, okay, it'll definitely have traction now. So for the first time, I can put my foot all the way to the floor. And it just lit them up. You can just hear, you can see you can just see the revs go whoop. And I can just feel the rear tyres just light up at 120, 130 miles an hour in third gear.
Whoa, bloody hell. I think one or two of our friends watching from the pit wall at the time said to each other, the clutch is slipping.
No. Tyre slipping. Tyre slipping. And it was,
wow.
But the other thing was, it was completely undramatic. If you'd said to me, you're going to spin the wheels of a 91730 at 120 miles, whatever, I wouldn't have got in the thing. But in fact, I heard it and I saw it on the rev counter, but in the car, it was nothing. It was absolutely nothing at all.
So apart from traction and all that power in such a light car, what are you managing? What's the sort of trickiest thing to deal with around the lap?
The trickiest thing is the chassis is not a problem. You'd be amazed. The car had great grip, great brakes, all that was sorted. So the only thing that you are, traction obviously, but more than anything else, you're just managing the boost. And when it's on boost, it's actually quite easy to modulate. So you've just got to keep the revs up, and you've got to accept that before the boost comes in, there's going to be a bit of a wait. And it was nothing like as bad as the early turbo car, the 91710, which was apparently a bit of a monster. And they'd really got on top of the turbocharging much better by the time the 91730 came along. Obviously you wouldn't want all the boost to turn out halfway through a corner, but you'd have to be an idiot to get yourself into that situation. It was, I suppose, to that extent, a bit of a point at the squirt machine. You couldn't balance it like you'd be able to balance a sports car 970. God, I sound like I'm some kind of expert in this. I'm not. I'm just an idiot who's driven this thing for a few laps. But
it's more than I've done. It's fascinating to hear anyway.
But the thing is that you have to think about all this stuff if you're not going to crash the car. You're not sitting there thinking, I'm going to break the lap record, I'm going to impress a load of people. You're just thinking, don't crash the car. Because even if it didn't technically end your career, I would be so ashamed of myself. I'd walk away from the business. I could never be.
You'd have to end it yourself, wouldn't you? Yeah.
Yeah. So that was that. Yes, and that was obviously Metzger's engine.
Bloody hell, that's incredible. His That amazing engine in that incredible car, and you're so fortunate to have driven the 917 a couple of times.
Yes, but I don't. But when I was your age, I hadn't driven one, so there's time yet.
There is hope. There is hope yet. Okay, well, you did mention it a little earlier on. There's another engine that is actually called the Metzger Engine, which has nothing to do with 917s. It's actually the flat six that it was in the GT1 car originally. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it's based on all sorts of things. I mean, people sort of think that someone just sort of sits down and think, I'll do an engine now. That's not actually what happens. You look at what you've got and you use components from here, there, and everywhere. And, its origins go back to, the 959 and the 956 and the idea of having water-cooled cylinder heads for those cars. And it kind of evolved, but I think sort of in sort of common parlance, most people think of the 911 GT1, which was the sort of, it wasn't really, it was a bit of, there were bits of 911 in it, certainly at the front end. It was the sort of mid-engine prototype with which Porsche contested Le Mans as a factory team in 96, 97 and actually won it in 98. And so that has the sort of, it's the engine with the proper dry sump, with the external oil tank, not a sort of split sump, sitting at the bottom of the engine. And then obviously it became famous because that was the engine that provided the basis of the GT3, the 996 GT3 in whenever that was, 1999, I think.
Yeah, and it continued to be used by that sort of GT3 RS dynasty right up, as you said, up until the RS 4 litre in 2011.
Yeah, and the irony being, by the time the first of these cars, by the time the first Porsche GT1 had appeared in 1990, Metzger had already retired. So it is his engine, but it is amazing how it was so good that it just lived on. And the reason it was so good, and I remember talking to Andy Preuninger, who many of you will know is the kind of the engineering guru at Weissach, who is the man. He's kind of Mr. GT3, and saying to him, why are you still using this old engine when Porsche keep on making all these new and he said, well, because it's the Metzger engine. He said it is so strong. It is so highly developed. It was so brilliantly conceived from the get-go. I mean, to the extent, why wouldn't you use it? We know it inside out. We know what we can do to it. We know we haven't got to the limit of its capability. So they just kept on using it. And clever old them, because as we know, Porsche did some, a non-Metzger, very much a non-Metzger engine for, the normal 996s and 997s, as lots of people listening to this will know, they have problems with intermediate shafts and rear main oil seals and goodness knows what.
Bore scoring as well.
Yeah, exactly, bore scoring as well. But if you had a GT3, or in fact, a turbo, because the 996 and I think just the first generation of 997 turbos, they were all Metzger engines too. And they don't have any of those problems, funnily enough.
It's incredible, isn't it? And you were talking earlier about a certain era of Porsche competition cars combining, like nothing else, huge power and performance with durability.
Yeah.
And they're the same attributes that
100%
that were in that Metzger engine many, many years later.
Yeah. Yeah. And when, if you remember when Porsche did the 991 GT3, which was the first GT3 engine not to be a Metzger engine, they had some issues with that, didn't they?
Yeah.
And it's an amazing engine now, and all power to them. But I think it just goes to show how difficult it is to do that sort of engine to the standard that that Metzger was just able to arrive at through his own genius. Yeah,
that's right. And the thing about that engine in 4 litre guise, as it was in that run out GT3 RS, with 500 horsepower from a 4 litre 6-cylinder normally aspirated engine. I mean, it's extraordinary for that to be in any way reliable, isn't it?
Yeah.
Wow, it's a remarkable feat. Okay, well, we'll talk about something else in a moment, but to finish off this chat about Hans Mezger, I just want to ask what you think about this, Andrew, because I mean, he's such a highly regarded engineer, and he has effectively an engine named after him. And I just wonder if we're going to see his like again. I mean, are any of today's engineers going to be sort of revered in the same way? I mean, you've mentioned Andy Preuninger. I suppose that there's a chance, and Walliser as well. There are also sort of high-profile test and development drivers like Matt Becker and Chris Goodwin, but I don't get the sense that we'll be putting those guys up on a pedestal quite like we have done Hans Mezger.
I know what you mean. I think there are a few reasons for that. I think there's a sort of a corporate culture issue. I think companies tend to be more collegiate in their approaches, particularly to publicising individuals. So more people I think the credit tends to get shared around more people. But I think the business of engine design is just so immensely complex now in a way it simply wasn't back in Metzger's day, with all the compliance, all the emissions, all the homologation, all this stuff. You couldn't just say, this is Fred's engine, because Fred's probably an army of people. But I do wonder whether people will come to recognise that actually having an engine named after a person and having that kind of revered quality about it actually isn't such a bad thing for your brand as a whole. We think of Ferrari, don't we? Think of Colombo engines and Lampredi engines and that sort of thing, and they're all part and part of the Ferrari mystique. But I can't see it. I just think that time possibly has gone.
I do tend to agree with you. Okay, well, there we go. From the sublime Hans Mezger's career and his extraordinary contribution to road cars and competition cars.
I know where you're going with this.
To the ridiculous. I want to talk. I wrote a piece about the new BMW 4 Series and what I consider to be an offensively ugly front grille. I mean,
come on, tell us what you really mean, Dan.
Yeah, there we go. As I wrote in that piece, I actually didn't really want to get drawn into that whole conversation because I just get the sense that BMW's designers are trying to be provocative and they want people to, debate the merits of their work and all this sort of stuff. And I just find, I feel like I've bitten, basically. I took the bait and I've bitten, but it got to a point where I just couldn't help myself because I'm sort of so offended by that enormous two-part front grille. I think it looks terrible. Even worse, actually, when there's a number plate slapped across it because...
okay, that's interesting.
You think it looks better, don't you?
I thought it was so bad that anything that sort of gets rid of a bit of it and sort of divides it, bisects it, makes it... But you actually think that makes it look worse.
Well, okay, I'm not sure if it looks better or worse, but I think it indicates to me that it almost says that they forgot there was supposed to be a number plate there, or they were sort of so determined to press on with this divisive design that it didn't matter to them that actually people are only ever going to see it with a number plate slapped across it. I get worked up about all this stuff. Do you think,
I mean, so can you put into words, and I'm not putting you on the spot here because I'm not sure that I could, but is it just the size of the thing, or is there a proportionality to it, or is there something offensive in the detail? Can you sort of say what it is about that grille that you dislike so much?
Okay, well, I will answer that in a moment. I think actually I can't put my finger on it necessarily. To me, it just looks so ugly, and I've not really interrogated it any more than that. But actually, what I find frustrating is BMW's approach to design at the moment, intentionally trying to be divisive. There's this quote that was published in Car Magazine last year from BMW's head of brand design. He's talking about being divisive, about design that divides opinion, okay? And he says, if you want to make recognizable design, you have to do this to polarize, because good design is about a very strong and unique character. It's not about beauty. So he's saying that, exactly, he's saying there that a well-designed car isn't beautiful, it's divisive.
But I mean, I could design, because I'm a really rubbish designer, I could design a really ugly car. It would stand out. Everybody would notice it. It wouldn't make it a well-designed car.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. And I absolutely refute the point that to create character, to create individuality, design has to be divisive. And I the car that I compared it to, or the company that I compared it to, in that post on DN was Polestar, which for me is perhaps more so than anybody else at the moment, is showing how classical, beautiful, understated design can stand out, can create individuality and character.
Absolutely.
And you put those two cars side by side, and there's just no competition. The other thing that I want to add to all of this is that, quite brilliantly, and I loved watching this unfold, was that car design superstar Frank Stephenson sort of weighed in the comments section on that post. And what I noticed first of all was that he was responding to everybody who was agreeing with my point of view. He was basically just replying with a whole stream of emojis, which was just brilliant to watch. And then he actually wrote a comment in response to somebody else, which I'll read to you now. He said,
just before you do that, can we just say, just for anybody who doesn't know, Frank Stephenson, he's a really, really nice bloke, but in design terms, he designed everything from, the first of the sort of BMW Minis to the McLaren P1. I mean, he is just the man. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. His work can be seen everywhere. And he literally wrote this in a comment in response to a DN follower. He said, "The geometric design of the kidney grille clashes with the organic design of the body. I get the feeling that different designers worked on this car and none of them liked or agreed with each other." Which is, and actually, I mean, that was a bit of a sort of eureka moment for me when I read it, because that ugly, brash, bold, geometric grille does sit pretty uncomfortably on the front of a fairly sort of, actually derivative, but organic and smooth-edged body.
I think one of the sadnesses, I may be in a minority of one here, but I actually think the rest of the car looks quite good. And I think that there was an opportunity to do, I mean, to me, it's the most distinctive 4 Series that we've seen, largely for the wrong reasons out the front. But the rest of it, I think it's certainly a fluent and proficient piece of design. And they go, and he's absolutely right, of course, because he's right. He's Frank, isn't he? But it is extraordinary, and it's like, to me, it smacks of some kind of insecurity. It's like, well, we're BMW, and what's BMW most famous for? Well, it's most famous for that grille, so we'll just make it bigger, and then people will think, yeah, that's a bin. That's how we make people recognise what we do, not by making beautifully proportioned, elegant cars. If you look at the Polestar, you can see an entire design language in that, which they will go on and develop and evolve, and everybody will know a Polestar when they see one. You don't need to put 2 great teeth on the front of it like that, and it's just sad, I think.
It just suggests to me that BMW have sort of run out of ideas. On the Polestar point, you can see, and also in modern Volvos, you can see a very clear and cohesive sort of objective when they set out to design those cars. You'll hate this word, but there's a very clear and distinct language. Whereas with lots of the German stuff that I'm seeing at the moment, BMWs in particular, but also certain modern Audis, it's as though they don't have a very clear idea, and so they just keep designing, keep doing a bit more here, a bit more there, and you end up with these sort of conflicting, quite fussy cars. And I feel like I'm seeing more and more of that stuff at the moment. I just want to do a little bit of sort of horn tooting at the moment, because the fact that Stephenson weighed in on that conversation, I think, is one of the reasons that I love doing DN so much, because it's out there in the sort of public domain where these industry figures exist. It's on Instagram. And so you won't get someone like Frank Stephenson signing up to an internet forum to respond to a stream of comments, or you won't get a guy like that signing up for a website to respond to an article. But because these guys are already on Instagram, spending time there, it's quite natural for them to come over to DN and respond to what we have to say.
I think I think it says a lot about the DN audience too. I think that people like him, I hope at least, identify, sometimes, if you go on, without naming names, other magazine websites, and you look at the comments, they just seem to be forums for people to hurl abuse at each other and to say, no, you're completely wrong about that, or that's rubbish, or, you're thick or whatever. And, we are so lucky. We just don't get that. We just get, properly enthusiastic, like-minded individuals who just love talking about the cars that we love. And I think, and I hope, that's why, somebody with his profile is happy to, just be out there and among this lot, because he identifies kindred spirits. And it's, as you say, it's one of the absolute best things about DN. It's basically got nothing to do with you or me.
Yeah, I think we sort of accepted that a little while ago, didn't we? Well, there we go. It should be its own thing, though, shouldn't it, with its own momentum? Right, okay. Well, let's move on to one final post. Andrew, you wrote a piece about homologation specials and how they very often make the best performance road cars.
Yeah.
But actually what I want to ask you about is the car that inspired that post, because you spent a day driving it last week sometime, and that's that gorgeous Alfa Romeo GTA.
Yeah. I think I probably enjoy driving anything at the moment. But so the GTA, it was just something that, I hadn't talked about it much because it was just something that came out of the blue, and I got to do this journey in it pretty much across England, and I've just loved GTAs. When you look on the internet at great homologation specials, they never come up. Everybody talks about everything from RS200 Fords to Integrales and all the other cars that we know, and E30 M3s and so on, and rightly so. But to me, it's one of the very first and one of the very greatest. And what I find so fascinating about it is just the extent that Alfa Romeo went to turn it, to make it homologation ready. So this, if people don't know, was a car that Alfa Romeo built in 1965 and 66. They only made 500 of them because that was the number that they were required to homologate the racing version. And it was based on the lovely, beautiful steel-bodied Giulia Sprint. But they just did, so they completely rebodied the thing in aluminium and pop riveted it all together. The inner body was made out of steel, but it was made out of specially thin steel. They put in Perspex windows. They developed a twin plug cylinder head for it. They've used mad stuff like it's got magnesium wheels, magnesium sump, magnesium bell housing, magnesium cam covers. It's got different door handle. It had bespoke suspension, brakes, just the whole thing. They'd just gone through it from end to end. And when you look at it, it just looks like a Giulia Sprint GT. And if you don't know, well, you'll know soon enough when you get in it, because it weighs about 750 kilos. And the race versions have 170, 180 horsepower these days. And in standard street version, it had 115 horsepower, which, whatever it was, 55 years ago, in a car that light was just amazing. And to drive it, it's everything I want an Alfa Romeo to be. It's beautiful, it's light, it's delicate, it's massively responsive. The feel you get from it, the steering, you've got an amazing twin cam engine up the front. The balance of the thing, the rear suspension actually is kind of all wrong geometrically, but what it does mean is you spend a lot of your time going sideways as well, and that's never boring. It's just it's just beautiful and brilliant and rare and special, and yeah, so lucky.
Who was it that described the GTA as a not very poor man's Ferrari 250 GTO?
I don't know, but they were right.
There's something in it, isn't there?
I think it's, yes, I think it probably is. I've always thought it, funnily enough, as being a not very poor man's short wheelbase. But yes, it's something like that, isn't it? You get, I would think point to point, it would scare a short wheelbase witless. I think you'd need to drive a 250 short wheelbase, a standard steel short wheelbase, very rapidly indeed to get away from a well-driven GTA. But what I love about it is it is just and it's broadening this out to all homologation specials. We all know of mad homologation specials like, the road-going Nissan R390 or the Toyota GT1 or the Porsche GT1, but those aren't, to me, homologation specials where cars get made in quantities of 1 or less than 10. To me, the great homologation specials are cars like the GTA where the base unit is a normal car. Be that car a 911 with the case of the 2.7 RS, or an E30 M3, or an Alfa Giulia Sprint, or a Ford Sierra. To me, that's where the magic of the homologation GT lies.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you ended that post, much to many people's surprise, actually,
oh, yes,
looking at the comments, by talking about a Toyota Yaris.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I was being a little bit provocative, but just because these cars have become revered in the past, we can't be sniffy about the future and just go because it's not one of them, because it's ahead rather than behind. Therefore, and it's a Toyota Yaris, therefore it's going to be rubbish, or it's not going to be as good, or at some stage in the future when we look back on it, it's never going to get on any of those lists. None of us have driven it. None of us know. Let's find out.
So for people who aren't necessarily aware, this is the Toyota GR Yaris that's been announced, and I think it's due to reach the first owners later on this year, I think. It's a 4-wheel drive Yaris with a turbocharged engine, I think about 260 horsepower.
Exactly right.
A manual gearbox, and and you can have LSDs in both axles if you spec the right option pack. And it does seem to be genuinely a homologation car for Toyota's World Rally Championship Assault. And it's been so long since there's been any showroom model that has anything at all really to do with a proper WRC car. Geeks like you and I, Andrew, we're just sort of beside ourselves with excitement for this thing.
Yeah, but also it just to me it just smells right. If you look at at the option packs and the spec and the and the crazy differentials you get, the options aren't sort of whether you have active or passive cruise control or or air conditioning or climate control. This is proper weapons grade stuff, and all of that just they're either playing a blinder. Or this is a car that means business, and until I'm perverted with incontrovertible evidence to the contrary, I'm gonna hope it's that.
Oh God, I'm so looking forward to driving it. I hope that happens soon. Oh, good. Well, there we go. Let's leave that one there. And before we go anywhere, just a quick reminder to all you lovely lot listening that if you feel like it's worth your time and your money, please do head to patreon.com/Drive Nation, where you'll be able to pledge as much or as little money as you like each month to help support DN's growth, essentially. We've got big ambitions for this thing. We really want to take it places. We want to do more with it. We want to bring in other voices as well. And a small contribution each month will really help that to happen.
Help it happen, and it will speed up the rates. I mean, we like all freelance journalists have, two problems of time and money, and there's never enough of either. And any help you can give us with one will shorten the amount of the other that we need to take, and it'll just make better stuff happen sooner. It is as simple as that.
And there is some exclusive patron-only content in it for everybody who does contribute. So that's patreon.com/Drive Nation. Right, well, let's leave that one there, Andrew. That was good fun. And to everybody listening, we'll talk to you again this time next week.
Look forward to it very much. All the best to everyone. I'll catch up with you then.
The Drive Nation podcast with Dan Prosser and Andrew Frankel.